Well, if you have clicked on this video and you're currently listening to it right now, then you've successfully located the video lecture for the introduction to Module 5 slated for Tuesday of week 14, at least 14 on the schedule on Canvas. So welcome. I'm glad that you decided to do your homework instead of just taking the week off entirely, which I would have understood as well, but you're here and you're diligent and you will be rewarded. So, welcome, as I said. Um, our whole job here for Module 5 is to synthesize all of the knowledge that we have learned throughout the semester in Modules 1, 2, 3, and 4. So very much everything that we're trying to do in this module is to synthesize. Now, the guise under which we are going to synthesize everything will be under Brave New World, which is why I have this first day dedicated to revisiting Brave New World. Even though it's been a couple weeks since we finished it, this is where the book really kind of takes a broader hold in our class, not only just in the discussions that we've had previously, but now we actually have to confront it on the broad scale and use it going forward. So, the first thing that I'd like to introduce us to, or maybe reintroduce us to, is something that is actually in the syllabus and that I believe I emphasized at the beginning of the semester, but I may not have emphasized clearly as we progressed forward. And that is that literature, at least as far as how we're using it in this class and how we're using Brave New World in this class, is that literature is an invitation for us to reflect on ourselves and the world around us. Okay. I think too often when we're being taught different literary texts, like you have to read Romeo and Juliet or Macbeth in high school, or maybe you had to read To Kill a Mockingbird or some other novel, there are certain questions that are acceptable in the eyes of your English teacher, and maybe there were some questions that were less acceptable in the eyes of your English teacher. Um, a good example of this would be if we were reading Pride and Prejudice, right? A good question to ask would be, how does this reflect um, the societal norms that were going on at the time that this novel was written, right? How is this novel a reflection of the time in which it was written? But a different question that I think many other people might ask if they're just reading Pride and Prejudice on their own might be, is Mr. Bennet a good father? So this may only make certain sense to those of us who have read the novel, but you can see the difference between those two questions. Um, One is a question about academically analyzing a work of literature as a kind of cultural artifact, which is just one way of looking at literature. Or maybe we close read the text for themes and that kind of thing, which we did a little bit during our discussions of Brave New World. But I think a much more enriching way to engage in literature, which is why I introduced it into this particular course, is that literature is actually challenging us to apply and to apply the ideas that it is trying to convey into the real world. We're literally meant to take a book, look down at the book, read the book, and then immediately look up from the book at the world around us and ourselves, and to question, are these things still relevant? Are there things that still resonate with the ideas that are being presented here, right? And I think that this is especially true for dystopian novels like Brave New World. Um, Huxley is very deliberately engaging in a kind of social critique through Brave New World. He's trying to get us to think about society as it exists now and where it is going. And another thing about this is that literature rarely, if ever, offers us clear answers. And I think we came across that several times during our discussion of Brave New World, where Huxley seems to have these binaries across the entire novel, some of which I'm going to talk about in today's lecture. And these binaries don't necessarily get resolved. They just kind of are emphasized and explored and elucidated, but we never really get a resolution necessarily between them. Or at least maybe we might get a resolution, but it's not one that's necessarily conceptual. It's more about how the story has to be able to end, which aren't always the same things. Excuse me. So I think that something that we are called to do in any work of literature that we're reading is that we're meant to really feel the different conflicts that we're seeing inside of the novel and use those conflicts as a way of questioning actual life that as it exists around us today. And again, I can't think of a genre in which that is more true than it is with the dystopian novel, which Brave New World is the progenitor of. So, as we're moving forward, right, we're going to return to Brave New World, and today's assignment is going to be centered on reflecting in general on Brave New World. You notice that we didn't quite do that the last day that we discussed Brave New World. We discussed the last chapter of it, but we didn't really get the time to reflect holistically on the entire work. And I delayed this in part because it takes time away from the work in order to treat it holistically and really kind of understand what actually stuck with me from reading this particular work of literature. What things still stand out in my mind a few weeks after the fact, as opposed to it still being fresh. So that's why I've maybe delayed a few weeks by a module, actually, our discussion of Brave New World in final, because I wanted there to be some space there. Okay. But our whole approach here is exactly this, is that Brave New World is meant to be applied. It's meant to be reflected upon, and those reflections are meant to shape how we understand the world as it is right now. Okay? So I have a few different concepts, four concepts anyway, that stood out to me. And so the rest of this lecture is really me modeling this way of thinking, or at least I hope it is, so that you might engage in some of that kind of thinking as well. So I'll share with you the four here. So the first thing that came to mind was soma. Second was religion and spirituality. Third is human intimacy and relationships. And the fourth thing that stood out to me were social roles, stability, and cohesion. Okay, so those are just four things that constantly stick out in my mind from this work. And so I'll go through each in their turn and describe to you guys exactly what I kind of got out of this. And hopefully it'll be enriching for you as well, at least metacognitively. You can see what I'm doing with each of these concepts as I go in their turn. So the first is Soma. And I think that more people, in my opinion, should know about Soma in Brave New World. Because once you understand what Soma is and how it functions in the New World society that they live in, you start to make connections more abstractly to things that exist in our own world. Um, I think that initially, right, at its forefront, Soma represents our human desire to escape, right? We somehow always want to avoid the unpleasurable things in life, and we may even want to fully dwell in a kind of state of ecstasy or bliss or happiness, whatever that may mean for you. And it's usually very physical and it's easy to do. And it seems to me like this is a fundamental kind of coping mechanism that human beings, at least in our current society, certainly in the society that Huxley was living within, and I think since probably the beginning of time, human beings have tried to cope with what I will call reality, with all of its sufferings, all of its difficulties, all of its pain, by trying to find some kind of antidote. Now, what that antidote looks like is not necessarily limited to the physical, right? It's not necessarily limited to substance abuse or simple substances, although substances tend to be the most popular form. Um, Human beings have been historically drinking alcohol since we've managed to figure out how to ferment bread and get the water out of that and all that kind of stuff, right? Even though it was very low percentage, we were still drinking. We were still using substances to find ways of heightening our perceptions and experiences of ourselves and the world around us, for better or for worse. Um, some people have claimed, of course, that alcohol usage is different today than it was thousands of years ago because of that lower dosage, but that's a totally different issue. Now, substances are one. Some people will use other kinds of substances that aren't directly hallucinogenic or psychotropic, I think is the more appropriate term, where the actual substance affects how you cognitize. Some people like food, even, right? They enjoy the luxury of food and being in a sort of sensory experience with food. Some people use human intimacy and sex, right? Where sex is the coping mechanism to deal with whatever pains are going on broadly in their lives. Some people will maybe more healthily use other things like, some people who use running as a coping mechanism or something, but that's still a coping mechanism that is being used to mask a certain pain that is evident in the person's life. And that seems to me to be what Soma perfects, right? And if I look around in the world today, I think that our modern form of Soma or really is our phones and social media and constant distraction and dopamine. That's just my personal take, of course. So you can have a very different take. I also think that maybe Huxley would make us question a little bit the rise of substance use, particularly in, say, even the legalization of, say, marijuana in various different states throughout the past 10 years. I have no particular opinion about marijuana usage myself, but it's all about the role that it plays in a given person's life and what role is it meant to play. Obviously, various different substances, whether it's marijuana or our phones and computers or what have you, all play helpful roles depending on who you are and what you're doing with it. Alcohol can be used to sterilize wounds, right? Some people use marijuana to treat Parkinson's, right? Phones are an excellent resource if you don't have a computer available and you need to look something up. It's an incredibly powerful tool. But the way we end up using it seems to be damaging. And then the extra layer on top of this is that Soma is um, a governmentally sanctioned substance, which means that the government is imploring their people and encouraging its people in Brave New World, of course, that people use it as a coping mechanism for that exact purpose, which is very interesting because now we're getting a government saying, hey, why don't you use this and it'll help you cope with your work, with your begrudging workday, so that we can actually get as much efficiency out of you as possible. Or, oh, you're not feeling great about how things are going in your life and in society in general, take some Soma, you'll feel better, right? And so these things that inherently in themselves I don't think are necessarily bad or harmful are being used not only in harmful ways because they're being used as coping mechanisms to mask pain, but they're also being used as means of control, right? Masking the pain for the purpose of stability and control on the part of the government. So those are just a couple things that I noticed with Soma. I think Soma is a really big thing. I think the idea of Soma and its role that it plays calls us to reflect on how are we using different um, substances and technologies and activities and all kinds of things. It calls us to question how we're using those and what role they play in our lives, and whether or not we're using them as a crutch or as a distraction or as a kind of coping mechanism or a drug, even, right? So, those are just some of my personal reflections on Soma. Religion and spirituality, second one. Excuse me. Um, this is very interesting because I don't entirely know what to make of it in this work. Um, the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that both the world state and the reservation that John comes from both have their forms of religion and spirituality, but they are very different and they seem to hold different roles in their respective places. In the New World society, um, spirituality and religion is highly controlled again by the government. They worship Ford, meaning Henry Ford, who is obviously the creator of the 40-hour work week and all that kind of stuff, the 8-hour work day, in order to improve efficiency. They worship things like, the Model T, which again is like the symbol of perfection and efficiency for them and all that kind of stuff. And then they also worship Freud as a kind of similar sounding name. They kind of put them together into one being. So just the fact that they even have a kind of God figure or like a figure that they revere in this sort of ritualistic and religious way is very interesting. But what's maybe less interesting is the fact that, of course, it's the government sanctioning this worship of this particular figure that represents all the things that the government wants to represent, right? Um, in this sense, we really kind of see the classic critique of religion being used as a kind of form of control and oppression, right? Where if you have a group of people in power, the religion itself is an arm to indoctrinate and put people into a certain frame of mind in order to control them once again, right? So we have that also kind of at play. But we also see that they have their own rituals in the world state, which we not watched, but read about in one of the earlier chapters, where Bernard is attending this orgy, and it is a soma-induced orgy, but it's not just an orgy. It's also really with this intent to invoke a vision of the Ford Freud deity figure that they all worship, and so they're doing this for an ecstatic experience, right? Which is very spiritual and very interesting because the combination of drug-induced ecstasy in a ritualized setting is common across many indigenous cultures, whether that's Native American or otherwise. We see that happen, at least at the higher echelons of their religions, respectively. Not all of them do that, by the way, but some of them really do, and it's very significant. And that's something that Huxley would have been privy to, especially in the 1930s, as more and more cultural anthropology was coming out at that time, where different anthropologists, despite their faults, were studying these cultures and their rituals and their rites of passage and all that kind of stuff. So it's interesting to me to see this kind of primally structured sort of ritual that they have here, where they're trying to invoke this ecstatic vision of Ford/Freud. And that's somehow a part of their very clean and pristine sort of religion that's state sponsored and everything. So that's very interesting on its own. But I think what we can still get out of that is that even religion and spirituality in the world state is centered on some form of pleasure. Right? Some form of ecstasy or bliss or happiness or joyfulness, as opposed to pain, which brings us to what characterizes religion outside of the world society. Outside of the world society, say in the reservation where John is from, um, all of the religious experiences, whether it's induced by John himself or it's what we see in, say, the rite of passage ceremony that he's denied going into, those ceremonies and those experiences are defined by pain. And that's another variety of religious ritual that we see again in indigenous cultures, again, across the globe, where pain is actually the mechanism for transformation or change in the ritual on the part of the individuals who are being initiated or going through the ritual or what have you. And this is particularly distinctive of rites of passage rituals, where young people, particularly usually young men in a given tribe, they're usually just boys, have to undergo a rite of passage that usually involves some kind of induced pain. Um, and that is sort of the culminating point where the boy, quote unquote, goes and turns into a man, quote unquote, and becomes a full member of the society or the tribe. For women, it's a bit different, but it still involves pain in many of these indigenous societies. The pain that makes a girl turn into a woman is through childbirth, which again, you can have critiques about that from like a feminist perspective of all of this, but this is what we've observed through cultural anthropology and by asking these people what they're doing and all that kind of stuff. Over the past century, right, of just observing and interacting with them. And Huxley, again, would be privy to this because this is the kind of thing that we find deeply in works by Mircea Eliade, who was a particularly prolific cultural anthropologist, along with a number of other cultural anthropologists of that day in the 1920s and 30s. They were studying and very preoccupied with rites of passage as well. And so the fact that, again, the rite of passage ceremony that John is denied from is centered on pain. And then John goes and inflicts pain upon himself in order to try to transform himself, kind of self-initiate himself, um, is distinctive, right? Because now we get this contrast of two very different spiritual and religious perspectives, worldviews, even, if you will, where spiritual change, on the one hand, is brought about by joy and ecstasy and bliss. And on the other hand, we have spiritual change is brought about by pain and suffering and sacrifice, right? Now, how do we put these two together? I don't have an answer for that personally. I'm sure that there's an answer between them somehow or another, and I'm certain that anybody who is religious genuinely in this class, who's listening to this right now, knows that that personal spiritual transformation and formation involves both. There are highs and there are lows. There's moments of joy and bliss and happiness, and then there are also moments of suffering and kind of dark nights of the soul and that kind of thing. So it seems that the most valid spiritual path across, most of our experiences, I would imagine, would be one that involves both. But for different reasons. Now, again, I can't come to a whole synthesis of these two, but that seems to be a very interesting contrast that I think we need to focus on in this work. Human intimacy and relationships is another thing that really kind of strikes me in this particular novel. The whole idea, the whole contrast between polyamory and I guess monoamory. I'm not going to say monogamy because there's no marriage, but many partners versus one partner, right? Between the world state and the tribal culture, and even just bringing this whole concept up, I think was really ingenious of Huxley because, I mean, he was writing this in 1931, published in 1932, and we don't get any signs of like, the sexual revolution or anything like that until the 60s. And it seems to me like he's not really arguing against either polyamory or monoamory, um, but he is trying to grapple with how are different kinds of human relationships um, valued and formed, and what kinds of relationships create what kinds of outcomes. And I was reflecting on this a little bit because it seems to me that, one of the things that contemporary society, or at least in the past 100 years, that contemporary society has been critiqued with is that marriage in particular as an institution, or compulsory monogamy and that kind of thing as an institution, um, is an institution that oppresses women. And that's a very common critique that's made. You can look into that if you want. Um, and that's interesting to me because what seems to be oppressing the people in the world state is actually their polyamory, not their compulsory exclusivity, right? And yet, it seems to me that the kind of brilliant thing that Huxley sort of presents here is that any kind of mandatory human relationship or mandatory sexual ethic can be used as a tool of oppression, as a tool of control, right? And again, we have different contrasting views about what is at the bedrock of a human relationship. Is it pleasure or is it something else, right? And again, I think we see this paralleling a little bit with the religious and spirituality subject, where on the one hand, we have the idea that everything is about pleasure, and on the other hand, we have everything is about suffering. But of course, relationships really are about both, right? For each relationship has both suffering and pleasure in it, right? It has joy and it has sadness at the same time. So we experience both, but it's interesting to see how when Huxley kind of separates these in certain ways, how different results can kind of follow, that it's not necessarily monogamy itself that's oppressive necessarily, but actually it could be any sexual ethic or human relationship dynamic that could be made oppressive if it is being used to do so, right? So that's kind of another interesting dynamic. Again, I don't have an answer for this, but these are things that I noticed that I think are really important. And then finally, social role, stability, and cohesion. I think we read the first few chapters of Brave New World with all the talk of eugenics and social engineering and Pavlovian conditioning and all that kind of stuff, and we react immediately very negatively to it, right? We have a knee-jerk negative reaction to the ideas of caste systems, of social engineering, of programming, of determining people to be in particular roles as we deem them, right? Kind of predestined. We don't like that, especially as Westerners. We much more prefer the kind of hyper individuality that we kind of are indoctrinated in, right? But I feel like whenever I look up around at the world, I find that there are a lot of people who struggle with this hyper individuality, that there are a lot of people who struggle with the idea that I have to make my own identity completely. Like there's no, as if though there's no cooperation or a conversation with the world around me about what is that supposed to really be or look like, even though I would argue that there is. And so a part of me thinks that while I would not advocate for any kind of eugenics programs or Pavlovian conditioning or, strict social castes or anything like that, I think that our society as it exists right now could do with a bit more social cohesion and stability in terms of what roles we're given, what roles do we play? Because I feel like maybe if we were in person right now and I asked you guys, many of you might have a problem answering that question. If I asked you, what role do you play in society right now? I feel like a lot of people will have trouble answering that question. And maybe to be fair, okay, a lot of us in this class are young. We're in college. We're trying to figure things out. We're trying to carve that for ourselves, right? And so that's good. You're trying to figure it out. You're trying to define it. But man, is it a hard task to carve out an entirely new identity, right? An entirely seemingly new role for oneself. So part of me says, yeah, I react negatively to the eugenics and the caste system and all that, but I also react negatively to the way that I see people struggle to find a place for themselves in contemporary society. And a part of me almost wishes we had a little bit more of that. So those are just some of my reflections on each of those um, four different ideas from Brave New World. And so now I pass the torch on to you guys in this. Okay, so our assignment that you'll see that should be made available, should already be made available by the time that you're watching this video, is to consider one theme, idea, moment, or character from Brave New World that stood out to you and respond to the following questions. And that's in light of all the things that I've discussed today. It doesn't have to be any of these four ideas that I've talked about. I would encourage you to find your own. Or if it was one that, I talked about and I said something and you want to reflect on that, that's totally cool with me too. Just as long as you're answering these different questions about that particular theme or idea or character or what have you. So first, you want to answer what idea or theme caught your attention the most and why. So what is the theme, right? How does this idea invite you to reflect on your own life, beliefs, or experiences? What questions does it raise for you? Do you agree or disagree with what the book seems to suggest about that particular topic? And can you connect this idea to anything you see happening in the world today, right? So again, this is very much about taking something from the book, something that you saw, something that you thought was interesting, something that stood out to you. It can be totally from memory at this point, or you can go back into the book and look. It's up to you. And to reflect on it, apply it to yourself, and apply it to the world around you. Okay? So that's it. So that's everything that we have for today. Complete that assignment. Check the due date on it. I'm not sure if I've determined that yet, but there will be a due date for it, probably the following Thursday. So just keep that in mind. And you'll hear my voice again on Thursday. So thank you for enduring this lecture, and I will see you guys in the next video.